Here are 35 rules for verbs that will make your English take off. This is a really special video because it's going to fill in so many gaps in your knowledge of advanced English grammar. Areas such as subjunctives, ergatives, ditransitives, delexicals, compound verbs, copulars, and more. So let's begin with subjunctives. With the subjunctive, put simply, we use the verb infinitive instead of changing for tense in the second clause. And this usually happens when showing importance or being hypothetical. Here's an example. I wonder if this has ever happened to you. It's definitely happened to me. My car made a strange noise yesterday. Maybe there's a problem with the gears. Maybe there's a problem with the brakes. What do? You probably speak to a mechanic. And this is the report you get. The mechanic insisted that he take the car into the garage. And I want you to focus on the word take here. Instead of saying he takes, we use he take. Here, take is the subjunctive. It's an important situation and we are reporting what the mechanic said. And in this situation, we can use the subjunctive form. Now, note that the subjunctive is fairly formal. It's quite old-fashioned, and therefore it's not particularly common, but you may come across it and there may be times you want to use it. But there is a more advanced issue with the subjunctive, and that is when do we use the past subjunctive and when do we use the present subjunctive? And in general, we follow this principle. For hypothetical situations, use the past subjunctive. That's for wishes or things that are imagined. Now, the past subjunctive is usually made by using the past form of to be, which becomes were. If my car were newer, I wouldn't have so many problems with it. And what you'll find in hypothetical situations such as if clauses or I wish, the next verb, if it's to be, always takes were. It's unusual to use was in any part of the uses of the verb to be. That's for the past subjunctive, being hypothetical. However, if you're trying to state importance, use the present subjunctive. So that's for things where there are proposals, suggestions, anything where you're trying to put importance on a matter. And look what's happened to the verb to be here. We have this rather unusual situation where we have be in the bare infinitive. It is necessary that my car be fixed by a trained mechanic. So here, be is the subjunctive form. Now, as I mentioned, it is rather old-fashioned and sometimes people do choose simply to use normal tense, but it is still used in English, so you do need to know about it. Let's move on to ergatives. Ergatives come from transitive and intransitive verbs. Let's first of all revise what we mean by transitive and intransitive. Some verbs are transitive. In other words, they need an object to come after them. For example, she borrowed my pen. You couldn't say she borrowed because the sentence would not be complete. We need the object for the sentence to be complete. We need to know what she borrowed, and she borrowed my pen. I paid the bill. It wouldn't be complete to say I paid without saying what you paid. We discussed the plans. These verbs are usually transitive. There may be some odd occasions where you can use them without an object, but that would be quite unusual. However, there are many verbs which are intransitive. These verbs do not have an object coming after them. For example, they laughed. We wouldn't say they laughed a book, they laughed a joke, they laughed with an object afterwards. It's just they laugh. We only need the activity here. Similarly, the situation deteriorated. Or, as is happening in the next few days after this video is released, the US citizens voted. These are intransitive verbs. So where does the ergative side come into this? Ergative verbs do something unusual because they are transitive when the subject does the activity, but they're intransitive when the subject receives the activity. Consider the examples here. We finished the performance. Here it's transitive. The performance is the object. And we do the activity. Who did the finishing? It was we. We actually did something, and finished describes the activity that we did. But the next example is different. The performance finished. Now, can a performance do an activity? No, it's not an object or subject that can do an activity. Finished is actually something that happened to the performance here. It's a bit like a passive form. And when we have verbs such as these that change between transitive and intransitive depending upon whether they're doing the activity or receiving the activity, then these are called ergative verbs. Common ergative verbs are these: change, close, dry, end, finish, move, open, start, stop. There are also other verbs that can change from transitive to intransitive. Now, some also call these ergative verbs. Many grammar books will not call these ergative verbs. They'll just call the previous type ergatives. It doesn't matter. What's important is you know how these verbs work. Sometimes verbs change from transitive to intransitive with no meaning change at all, and it doesn't matter what the subject or the object is. For example, I am driving a car. That's transitive because I'm telling you what I drive. What do you drive? A car. But at the same time, I can use it in an intransitive way. I am driving. Here, I'm just focusing on the activity and I don't need to add the object. Some verbs work like this. Other verbs can change from transitive to intransitive, but they do have a meaning change. Look at the word returned in the examples at the bottom. Victoria returned the dress she didn't want. Victoria went out, but she has just returned. Here, the verb returned has different meanings. In the first example, Victoria returned the dress, which is transitive because there is an object. This means she gives something back. She returned the dress. She gave the dress back to the shop, as in the picture in blue. But Victoria went out, but she has just returned, which is intransitive. It means come back. She has just returned means she has just come back. So the verb changes meaning when it changes from transitive to intransitive. And there are many verbs that do this. You do need to learn them one by one, but you must be aware that this can happen. Now, if we're being more advanced still, we can look at what happens when transitives or intransitives are attempted to be put into the passive form. Now, transitives can take the passive form. So, I am driving a car can become a car is being driven by me. So here there is an activity, there is an object, therefore we can use the passive. But intransitives cannot. I am swimming. We can't make this passive. We don't have an object to move into the subject position. Now, there's much more to know about English than I can go through in this video. So if you want to go deeper with English, try one of my courses. There are links in the description below this video. Let's go on to ditransitives. Now, ditransitives are related to verbs that can take two objects. And there are a number of verbs that work like this. For instance, he gave a gift to his father. Here we have two objects, a gift and his father. A gift is called the direct object because that's what is affected by the action he gave. What did he give? A gift. But his father is affected by the action too. He gave a gift. Well, who to? His father. So the indirect object is his father, affected by the activity, and a gift is directly related to the activity, so that's the direct object. Similarly, he sent her friend a card. So here the order is reversed. She sent, what did she send? She sent a card. So the direct object is at the end of this sentence. But who did she send the card to? Well, she sent it to her friend. And these types of verbs are called ditransitive. In general, when the direct object comes before the indirect object, we separate with a preposition. So you would have noticed he gave a gift to his father. So here, direct object first, indirect object after, a preposition in between. When we reverse the order, you probably noticed that we didn't have a preposition. So when the indirect object comes first, don't use a preposition. Let's be a bit more advanced now, though. When converting to the passive form, you have two choices. You can either put the indirect object at the beginning of the sentence or the direct object at the beginning of the sentence. But there's a small difference in how you do it. First of all, we're going to look at putting the indirect object at the start of the sentence. So when converting to the passive and the indirect object moves to the start of the sentence, the direct object goes before the subject, which has now moved to the end of the sentence. So let's work that through as an example. I gave a gift to my father. A gift is the direct object. My father is the indirect object. Make it passive. My father, the indirect object, goes to the front. A gift, the direct object, stays after the verb, but before by me, which is the subject. I has now moved to the end of the sentence by me. But a small difference if we do it the other way round. When the direct object moves to the start of the sentence, the indirect object goes after to, but still before the subject. So I gave a gift to my father. If instead we put a gift at the start of the sentence, then we say a gift was given to my father. So we keep that word to there, but all of that goes before me. A few verbs cannot be followed by the pattern indirect object, direct object. These verbs must take the direct object first. For instance, I explained our ideas to her, not I explained her our ideas. So our ideas is what we explained, it's the direct object. Her is the person affected by the explanation. And with this verb, we must put our ideas first and her afterwards. Verbs such as describe, explain, outline and share work in this way. So it's really important to be aware of this because it looks completely wrong to a native speaker if you switch the direct object and indirect object in the wrong way with these verbs. So make sure you learn them, make sure you use them in the appropriate way. Now on to delexicals. Usually, verbs describe the activity in a clause. I composed an email. So the activity here is composed. That's what happened. You won a prize. The activity here is won. That's what happened. But there are some verbs where this does not always apply. Delexical verbs can shift the activity onto the object. Consider these two examples in blue at the bottom of the screen. I gave it a try. What's the activity here? Well, the activity is actually try. I gave it a try means I tried. Also, I had a shower. What's the activity? Had is normally to do with possession. I didn't pick up a shower and walk around the town with a shower, did I? No, shower is the activity here. And give and have are two verbs that can be delexical. Sometimes they carry the activity. Sometimes they point to a word afterwards, which has the activity. And verbs that do this include do, give, go, make, have, and take. Compound verbs refer to English verbs which are a combination of two words. Work through the example here. We have a picture of a brain and a picture of a storm. What are the different topics? Let's imagine we're having a discussion, we're preparing perhaps an essay together as a group of people, we're trying to come up with ideas, and we say, what are the different topics? And someone in the group says, let's brainstorm them. So brainstorm is actually a verb here. I brainstorm, you brainstorm, we brainstorm. It's a verb. But what's it made up of? It's made up of two words. Brain means thinking. Storm means intense activity. Put them together and you get the verb brainstorm, which literally means intense thinking. And there are a number of English verbs which do this. Now, by far the most common way to make a compound verb is where you use a prefix followed by the ordinary verb. So let's think about perhaps the verb estimated, which is at the bottom of the screen. I estimated the answer. Well, we can make this compound by adding overestimated, which means estimated too high, or underestimated, which means estimate too low. So various ways to make compound verbs in English. Sometimes we simply take two words and put them together. Very often we'll use a prefix with a verb to make a compound verb. What are copular verbs? Copular verbs link the subject to an activity or noun that comes after the verb. For example, the food tastes nice. So here, nice is not affected by someone tasting something. Nice actually describes the food. So there's a difference to how verbs normally work in this case. Taste simply links nice to the food. So it's different to most other verbs because usually the verb carries the activity or the purpose of the sentence. For example, the child went to school. And here clearly went describes the activity that the child did. Go back to the previous example at the top of the page. The food clearly does not do the activity of the verb. The food doesn't do any tasting here. The verb tastes nice. It simply links a description to the word food. Now, typical copular verbs, there are more than this, but some of the most common ones are appear, feel, look, seem, and sound. It gets a little bit more complex though. First of all, copular verbs are followed by nouns and adjectives, but not adverbs. And just let me check before we go to the next parts of this video, because I'm going to go through situations where you have a choice. But when verbs are being used in a copular way, then you need to follow them with a noun or an adjective, not an adverb. So the food tastes nice, but not the food tasted nicely. It doesn't work here. I'm going to come to a situation where it does work, but not at the moment. As I said, some verbs can be copular or non-copular, and this depends upon both the type of verb and the subject. And here we're going to get to a situation where we can use the adverb eventually. I'll get there in a moment. Compare these two examples. The food tasted nice. The boy tasted the food. Can you see the difference here? The food tasted nice. The food cannot do the activity. So nice describes the food. But the boy tasted the food. Well, the boy can do the activity here. So here it's non-copular. And that means the boy does the activity. The boy does the tasting. So food is not describing the boy anymore. Food is what is affected by the boy tasting. It's what he tastes. And now we can use the adverb. The boy tasted the food nicely. In this particular sentence, nicely can describe everything that happened before. What about the causative? The causative is used when something happens because the subject of the sentence arranged it. In other words, the subject doesn't actually do it. There's a few verbs where we could use the causative. Made is one of them. The manager made me work overtime. So, did the manager do the work? No, the manager made me do the work. So there's two activities going on here. I do work, but someone forced me to do it. Notice the pattern here, made me work. Made, then the object me, and then work in the bare infinitive. Not made me to work, but made me work. Let is another form of causative. Here, instead of being forced to do something, I'm allowed to do something. The manager let me finish early. So the manager forced something onto me. In this case, it's not forcing, it's actually allowing. So the manager allowed me. And then the activity finish is actually something that the manager caused me to be able to do. The manager let me finish early. A common causative verb is with get. Now here, the subject arranges for someone to do something. My manager got me to train new workers. So here, got really means arranged. My manager arranged for me to train new workers. The activity is train, but I didn't do it of my own choice. It was arranged by the manager. Similarly, have. My manager had me working at weekends. And this also means something was done for the subject. So my manager had me, made an arrangement for this activity to happen. Had me working at weekends. So those are some typical causative forms. But we have an issue when choosing between get or have. Are they exactly the same, or are there any differences between them? Well, there are some small differences in emphasis. Get emphasises the forcefulness of the arrangement. If you say, my manager got me to make him a cup of tea, we get this impression of a manager being quite forceful. There's almost like there was no choice. They did something that meant it was necessary for me to do it. Here, notice the pattern. Got, object, to, then infinitive. Compare that with have, though, which emphasises the activity. Look at the following. The manager had me make him a cup of tea. Here, had feels softer. It doesn't have that same emphasis of pressure on it. It's simply reporting that there was an arrangement. Here, now, the focus falls on the activity more. Make. So, in one sense, they're interchangeable. Got and had both mean there's an arrangement for someone else to do an activity, but the emphasis can fall slightly more one way with got or get, slightly more one way with have or had. When we use the auxiliary and the negative form, usually it's fairly straightforward. It's fairly basic. Most negatives require an auxiliary. I own a cat. I don't own a dog. So the negative is made up of do as an auxiliary and not abbreviated to N''T if you're writing to make the negative form. Or I went to university. I didn't start work until I was 21. But there is a case where this is different. With feelings and mental processes, you can use verb followed by not when answering questions. For instance, do you think people should go to university? If you think no, you don't have to say, I don't think people should go to university. You could say, I think not. It's rather formal, but it is something that people use. It's kind of the opposite of I think so. I think so means yes. I think not means no. And this not form is still used quite a lot by native English speakers, particularly after certain verbs, such as I hope not. Are they going to arrive late? I hope not. That's a kind of structure that is used quite a lot, so it's worth knowing, worth listening out for, and sometimes worth using. Verbs and prepositions have certain rules that are worth knowing. Many verbs require a preposition to go before the object. Verbs such as listen or looking or look. You should listen to that, not you should listen that, or you should listen to the music. You should listen to that. You should listen to the music. Or he is looking at the stage. Not he is looking the stage, or he looks the stage. He looks at the stage, or he is looking at the stage. Now, you may have been aware of that, but it's also important to be aware of this. If the object is dropped, the preposition is also dropped. So instead of saying you should listen to, we don't do that. We say you should just listen. You should listen. Or instead of saying he is looking at, we simply say he is looking. The preposition is dropped. State and active verbs at one level is quite simple, but there are some complications to be aware of. Let's start by looking at the simple rules. State verbs take the simple form, whilst active verbs can take the continuous form, but of course only in a suitable context if you're trying to describe an activity. Active verbs can also be in the simple form too. Let's compare two of these verbs. One is state, one is active, and it's worth saying that most verbs are either state or active, not both. So the first example, I believe that the US election result is fair. Well, I've produced this video a week before the US election result in 2024, and we're all hoping that people are going to say it's fair. Here, believe is a state verb. We wouldn't say I am believing. It may be possible in a very informal scenario, but in general, people will say I believe, not I am believing. I am voting in the US election, though. Vote is an active verb, so vote reflects the activity here. I am voting. I use the continuous form to reflect the fact it's an activity that I'm doing. But some verbs to do with sense can be both state and active. Consider the verb smell. Dinner smells lovely. Here it's a state verb. The dinner's not actually smelling anything, so there's no activity to do. So smells stays simple. But what about if it's the dog, not the dinner? The dog is smelling the dinner. I hope that's not happening to you. If you're watching this video and you have the dinner on the table, make sure your dog or cat is not smelling your dinner before you carry on. Maybe this is a reminder for you. But here the dog is doing an activity with smelling. So smell can be a state and smell can be an activity. Furthermore, mental process verbs can sometimes be state or active as well. For example, I consider the vote to be fair. So here it's a state form. Or I am considering whether to vote or not. Here it's an active form. And there is a small meaning change here. In the state form, I consider means you've reached a decision. But in the active form, I am in the process of reaching a decision. And we can use this pattern with many mental process verbs like consider. If you are stating what is the truth or a result you've come to, then you'll use the state simple form. But if you're focusing on the process, then you may use the active form. Some verbs change between state or active depending upon whether you are discovering the quantity of something or reporting the quantity of something. If you're discovering the quantity of something, it becomes active. For example, she is weighing the ingredients for the cake. Weighing here is an activity, but it changes when we are reporting the quantity. The cake weighs 10 kilograms. We would not say the cake is weighing 10 kilograms. And we would not say she weighs the ingredients for the cake if we're actually reporting an activity. So the verb weigh and some other verbs where you're talking about the quantity of something in a verb can change in this way. To be is commonly known to be a state verb, and it generally shows permanence of something, or completeness, or truths, or facts. But it can be an active verb too, in order to show temporary behaviour. She is normally a quiet child. Well, this is stating the permanent side of this child, that that is the normal expectation. This is what she is like all the time, or virtually all the time. However, just for today, she is being really noisy today. And here we use the active sense, is being, to show that this is a temporary behaviour state for the child. And to see is usually a state verb for information received through the eyes, but there is this completely different meaning of see, which is when it is an active verb for relationships and meetings. So compare these. I see a mountain in the distance. This is information received through the eyes. But I am seeing an old friend in a cafe by the mountain. Here it's an activity describing a meeting that you're having with someone.